And now I'm honored to welcome retired U.S. Army Major John Spencer, Chairman of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute and the author of Understanding Urban Warfare. He has spent over a decade researching, publishing, and lecturing on the phases of urban warfare, and is considered a world-class expert in the field. Thank you so much for joining us today. So if I'd ask you to assess Israel's war fighting in Gaza after 4 months, what would you say?
I would say in comparison to any similar context, although there is none, with the underground tunnel networks built under civilian areas, the hostages, the rockets, but under all metrics, the IDF have performed historically, as in the steps to reduce civilian casualties, the pace to clear dense urban areas, the pace to eliminate enemy personnel, since 18 of the 24 battalions have been dismantled. By all measures of actual war and warfare, the IDF are really writing the book on how it can be accomplished and the pace it can be accomplished.
So what would you say to those, mainly in the US, saying that it takes Israel too much time and too many casualties, 25,000 or so in Gaza? What Israel should answer? What would you answer to that?
I would answer that, one, you have to acknowledge the context in which this war has, adhere to the laws of war and analyze them, but also recognize the precautions that Israel has taken that no military on the planet has ever taken in a war, to include the United States. And nobody has faced this type of war, this very unique type of urban warfare in history, especially in modern history. So I would say that the statement to take the civilian casualty number and then infer indiscrimination or infer an ineffective war campaign is just not backed up by data and science or history or fact.
So what you're saying practically is the world is used to different wars from different times. It hasn't adjusted itself to the new war, mainly that war.
So yes, I would say yes, and one, the world got used to a different type of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency war. It's also, this is the greatest test of Western war we've ever seen, because the world also wants to forget all the nation states that don't follow the laws of war, which Israel does, the United States does, but people like Russia, Syria, and others who have been conducting wars in front of everybody's eyesight, but not following any law of war and actually committing genocides. But yeah, yes, the world has forgotten what war looks like, maybe. They also aren't recognizing the steps in which Israel is taking to prevent civilian casualties, which are historic. But I think we even forget our own history. This is where I try to give comparisons, since I've studied urban warfare for so long. It's like, if you want to compare and contrast, but although you can't, because there is no modern example, and even if I go back to World War II, there are some similarities, but there's not. But we've forgotten our own history, and then criticize, not anybody specifically, but much of the world, criticize Israel as in there's another way to do it. Forgetting the hostages, forgetting the rockets, and that they're forgetting the time, the global international will, is that there's an ideal that there's another way to do it with less civilian casualties, less destruction, and that is actually a very false statement.
Furthermore, when I write here or lecture to both Israeli and foreign audiences, what I say is that the ordinary audience in the US or wherever think that we're fighting soldiers and tanks and airplanes, whereas our enemy fights from within their civilians towards our civilians, using both in their favor against us, and we can't use both against him.
Absolutely. And this is where I want the laws of war enforced. I want all of the laws of war, customary law, all of them enforced. And I want people to recognize that the IDF is following them, but to recognize what Hamas built. Hamas, for the first time in history, built an entire strategy, decades and billions of dollars given to Palestinian people for aid, and built a military industrial complex of networks and tunnels underneath the civilians to use the strategy of making it look like Israel is not following the laws of war or is doing something historically bad when it's actually not. But people won't recognize what Hamas has built, nobody's ever faced.
But maybe, that's the future wars. I mean, the world has been arguing, experts like you and myself, in a way, have been arguing that the international wars were okay for Second World War and further, but they're not okay for the war against terrorism, especially not such urban wars. And the world should adjust it to the current war. And maybe the Gaza war is the first case that the world sees of the new type of war.
Yeah, I've been saying that for many years as well. And there's an old general who said that the enemy has observed the recent wars of like Chechnya and things like that, and then understand they can gain an immense military advantage even against the world's most powerful militaries by pulling themselves into urban areas, using civilian casualties to influence the international will to allow wars to happen. But I 100% agree with you is that militaries and the IDF uniquely, and I've been studying the IDF military for years as well, both in urban warfare and underground warfare, uniquely designed themselves to be able to address these challenges that militaries and the world wants to avoid, which because we don't want to see combat in urban areas. But if the enemies of the world, literally terrorist, evil regimes, know that this will complicate our liberal Western democracies, values-based, law-abiding forces, then that's where war will continue to go, especially if you reach a point like we're seeing in this war, where the world says, even if you are following the laws of war, it's too much, you should stop. That's a very dangerous world in which you're creating, because then every terrorist organization of the world can learn, hey, look, Hamas built a strategy for us. All we have to do is build tunnels underneath civilian areas, use hospitals, use civilian deaths for our advantage, and we'll win a political war.
So if I'd ask you for our audience to give similarities and differences between our war, current war in Gaza, and wars that you've searched and investigated and you know very well. For example, the U.S. war in Iraq, Mosul as a test case, or the Russian war in Ukraine currently. What would you say?
I would say that if you really, really looked at those case studies, not only would you find a lot of worse things that happen, you'd also identify where there are differences. So yes, the 2016 to 2017 Battle of Mosul was initially used to compare like the Battle of Gaza City, although you have to recognize that Israel has been fighting 7 major urban battles against 7 major urban areas. So to compare and contrast is really hard. But some of the actions, ISIS, only 3,000 to 5,000. You say only, you don't want to be dissensitive. But in that battle of Mosul, 3,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters held a city captive to include 800,000 civilians. But it took 100,000 forces, 9 months, and destroyed most of the city, destroyed entire hospital complexes, killed 10,000 civilians, wounded and killed 10,000 of their own soldiers, the Iraqi soldiers, in order to take that one city. So if you want to do comparisons, you can to the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, like the Battle of Mosul, Raqqa, Aleppo, and others, to include with U.S. air power and advisors. But you'll actually come up with data that shows that Israel is doing it more efficiently, quicker, with less harm to civilian life, implementing more prevention of civilian harm. Now, if you go back farther, and I do this for my research, I mean, you could go back to World War II battles like the Battle of Manila, which actually has some of the similarities, where it took over 40,000-ish American and Philippine militaries to take 17,000 Japanese Navy out of the city of Manila, but they killed 100,000 civilians to do that. Now, that was during World War II. Of course, the world has tried to agree to Geneva Conventions and other things to not let that happen again. But all the history of war shows that when there is an enemy embedded in an urban area, there is no low collateral damage, low civilian casualty, non-destructive way to get them out. It's just not.
So if you were to advise the Israeli army, the IDF, or the Israeli government, and they would ask you, okay, given your expertise, how should we, Israel, fight in Gaza in a better way, if such a way exists, or in a way that will convince the world better than we do currently?
So I've been trying to help with that. One is all war is a contest of will. So where the use of force is not as important as the perception of the use of force, which Israel has done and the IDF have really tried to do. But even when, like the ridiculous South African claim against Israel and the ICJ, in my personal opinion, was devout of the history of urban warfare or similar cases, when given the context of the challenge, even following every letter of the law of war and every precaution, that even if somebody else would have done this operation, it would have been worse. But I can't recommend how to do it differently. I teach courses on urban warfare, and I will be using many of the things Israel has done as examples of how to do it, not how to, because Israel has even learned as they fought this war to include handing out their own maps, which as a military professional, I'm like, that's historic. And in some ways, I don't know if that can be repeated, but giving out your maps to the civilians and to the enemy to say, look, I'm only going to operate in this small area and we need to evacuate the others. How to do it better? I mean, I think Israel has seen amazing resolve, both domestically and internationally. The IDF have accomplished what people said, to include me, because I thought the IDF would lose hundreds, if not thousands more IDF soldiers to accomplish what they have done already. But to say how to do it better, I don't have any recommendations, but you maintaining the political will and finishing the remaining Hamas is the best way to bring the war to an end, is to eliminate that last bit of Hamas fighters, in my opinion, and bring the hostages home.
I'll give you two quick thoughts of mine on why the results are different than you've expected. Because Israel has shifted most of the population out in order to avoid killing as many as possible and to leave the area clean in order to be able to fight as many terrorists as possible. And B, because Israel takes its time. It takes time to eliminate the tunnels, to operate in the tunnels. And if the world thought that it can be done, in a split of a second, it's not possible.
No, and I can give you so this is the time factor. I agree with you, but it's not possible. And I can show you a lot of case studies where it would have taken, like it took 9 months to clear Mosul, and there wasn't tunnel complexes, and there wasn't hostages, and there weren't rockets. But I can show you historical urban battles where it took 2 weeks to clear a single building, let alone an entire city or an entire block. It's just not historic. And the IDF have uniquely designed, trained, manned, and equipped to be able to accomplish what people thought was, to include me, would have cost a lot to do.
John Spencer, I would pay a lot to be a student of yours in that course, but we still have a war over. But when our war is over, I'll get back to you, and then
all right.
I'll be honored to listen. Thank you so much for being our guest tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.